overlooked and forgotten by everyone until a black boy with a cart stopped. He didn't know who she was, but that choice changed his life forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The city breathed in metal and exhaled smoke. Even in the early hours of morning, the streets were slick with the residue of machinery and rain, and the sky above looked more like a tarnished sheet of steel than a canvas for sunlight. Buildings hunched low and wide across the district, their walls stained with time and neglect, windows blank and lifeless, as though the people inside had long since given up the act of watching the world. In this part of town, no one looked up. There was no reason to. Hope didn't visit often, and when it did, it rarely stayed. 14-year-old Jaden moved like he was born of this concrete, light on his feet, fast when necessary, invisible when it helped. He maneuvered his rusting wheelbarrow with a kind of practiced urgency, as if every second wasted might cost him something vital. The wheel shrieked every third turn, the handles were wrapped in old cloth to protect his already blistered palms, and the frame wobbled on uneven ground. But it was his lifeline, his job, his burden. The wheelbarrow wasn't meant for what he used it for. It had been designed for construction, meant to haul bricks, dirt, metal. Jaden had found it behind an abandoned warehouse when he was 11, rusted and half-buried in vines. He had pulled it free, patched the tire with layers of duct tape, reinforced the tray with scavenged wood and wire, and over time it had become an extension of himself. It was how he earned what little he had, transporting scrap metal to junkyards, carrying buckets of sand for masons, moving trash for shopkeepers who didn't want to deal with the city's delayed sanitation. Anything that paid, even if only in food or enough for a bar of soap. He didn't go to school anymore. That dream had ended when his mother fell. One minute she was standing in the kitchen, boiling rice on their single hot plate, and the next she was crumpled on the floor, her left side unresponsive, her eyes wide with confusion. Stroke, they said at the clinic. They didn't ask if he had insurance. They barely asked his name. He was told to care for her, and he had, every day since, feeding her, turning her, cleaning her, watching her fade a little more each week. They lived in the basement room of a sagging 2-story building that leaned against a liquor store like a drunk friend needing support. The rent was paid in cash, weekly, and their landlord never smiled. Their room smelled of dampness and bleach, a mixture Jaden had grown to associate with safety. The small window let in almost no light. When it rained heavily, water seeped through the cracks in the floor. There was no heater. On cold nights, Jaden would wrap himself and his mother in every piece of fabric they owned and press his back to hers for warmth. She couldn't speak clearly anymore, but she would hum sometimes, low and broken, and Jaden would listen until he fell asleep. He had learned to measure his days not by hours, but by deliveries. A good day meant 5 or 6 short-distance runs. A bad one meant walking across the city with 40 pounds of concrete mix in the tray and not enough change for a sandwich. He kept his head down, worked fast, stayed out of trouble. Trouble, he knew, found boys like him easily. Tall for his age, with skin the color of deep earth and eyes that scanned like a hawk's, Jaden had long understood that even silence wasn't always enough to be safe, but it was better than drawing attention. That morning had begun like most others. He rose before the sun, washed his mother, made her tea, half water, half milk, and tucked a blanket over her legs. She looked at him with clouded eyes, her face slack and unblinking. He kissed her forehead before slipping out, pushing the wheelbarrow past sleeping cars and boarded up storefronts. The city was still stretching when he reached his usual routes. The first job was hauling broken tiles from a repair site to a dumpster on the other end of the block. The second was delivering old appliances to a junk shop that paid by the pound. The third was collecting discarded copper wiring from behind a half-collapsed shed. By the time the sun reached its highest point, though still barely visible through the grimy clouds, Jaden's shirt clung to him with sweat and dust. His hands ached, his legs pulsed, but he couldn't stop. He still had 3 jobs to go. Each stop was like a small test of will. Some of the workers called him names, teasing him for being the kid with the squeaky cart. Others ignored him completely, tossing coins into his palm without eye contact. He took it all without complaint. The only time he let himself feel anything was when he turned a corner alone, the city noise muffled by alleys and distance, and he could let his shoulders drop for a moment. Sometimes in those short respites, he imagined something different. A home with light, a table with food, his mother smiling again. He didn't allow himself those thoughts often. They hurt too much when they ended. By early evening, Jaden was pushing the cart up a cracked sidewalk on the edge of the industrial district, the final delivery still ahead. A man had promised payment for transporting ceramic tiles from one site to another, a 30-minute trip across uneven streets. Jaden had timed it carefully. If he finished before sundown, he could buy bread and eggs, maybe even fruit if there were deals at the night market. And then home, to boil water, wash his mother, and rest on the floor beside her. The cold began to creep in around then. Not the sharp, biting cold of winter, but the quiet warning that the seasons were shifting. The kind of chill that slipped under sleeves and collars, wrapping around the spine like a whisper. Streetlights blinked on sluggishly, casting pools of dull orange along the sidewalks. People hurried past, clutching jackets and bags, eyes locked on the ground. It was as he passed the intersection near the overpass that he saw her. At first, she seemed like a part of the street, a figure too still to be real. But as he drew closer, he noticed the way her coat moved in the wind, the way her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the handle of a worn leather purse. Her hair was white, almost translucent in the streetlight, and her posture was too upright for someone simply waiting for a bus. She turned her head toward every passing car with a look that wavered between hope and confusion. Jaden slowed. Something about her struck him. Maybe it was her age, or how out of place she looked here, or the way no one else even glanced in her direction. He wasn't sure, but he stopped. Not fully, just enough to let the wheelbarrow rest on its frame, to take the pressure off his arms. He watched her for a moment, trying to decide what to do. He thought of the tiles he was supposed to pick up. He thought of the money he needed for rent. He thought of his mother, likely waiting in silence and darkness. Time was not his friend. He had none to waste. But the woman looked at her feet like they had betrayed her, like they no longer knew where to go. And Jaden moved. He didn't know that this single act would shift the course of his life. Didn't know that behind her vacant expression and frayed purse was a name known to banks and boardrooms. Didn't know that the address engraved on the silver pendant around her neck would lead him far from everything he had ever known. At that moment, he wasn't thinking of reward or consequence. He was thinking of the way people passed without seeing, and how, for just once, he couldn't be one of them. He stepped forward, hands still blistered, chest tight from the weight of the day, and offered what little he had, a ride in a battered wheelbarrow and the courage to go just a little farther. The wheelbarrow creaked as Jaden pushed it forward, metal straining under its own age. The woman stood beneath a flickering street lamp, the light cutting across her thin frame like a stage she never asked to be on. Her beige coat, which might once have been elegant, now clung to her like a paper shell, and the wind tugged at its edges. Her eyes were turned toward the road, scanning each car that passed with a quiet desperation. No one stopped. No one even slowed. The world around her moved too fast, as if she existed outside of its rhythm. Jaden approached slowly, unsure of what to say or how to even begin. He had helped people before, lifting boxes, carrying groceries, holding doors, but this was different. She didn't look like someone who had just missed her bus. She looked lost in a deeper sense, like someone who had wandered too far from familiar ground and only now realized it. Her lips moved without sound, and her gaze drifted toward a faded bus sign mounted crookedly to the post. Her fingers traced the lines of the schedule as though trying to make sense of numbers that had no meaning anymore. When she finally turned to him, her expression was one of startled awareness, as if she had just remembered the presence of other people. Her eyes were pale blue, rimmed in red, and seemed to waver between recognition and confusion. Jaden asked if she was okay. The words felt small in the cold. She blinked slowly, then looked down at her purse, clutching it closer. "I'm waiting for the 12, she said, voice thin as parchment. "To Willow Lane. Or was it Garden Hill? I always mix them up." He nodded, though neither name rang familiar. She continued, more to herself than to him, describing landmarks that didn't exist nearby. She mentioned a pharmacy that had closed down years ago, a diner that was now a chain sandwich shop, and a street with oak trees that had likely been cut down long before Jaden was born. Her sentences looped back on themselves, spiraling like autumn leaves caught in wind. Jaden's instincts screamed the truth. She didn't know where she was, and she didn't know how to get home. He looked down at her hands, shaking, frail, dotted with liver spots. She was cold. Her breath came in short bursts, visible in the night air. Her shoes, polished and low-heeled, were not made for long walks. She must have been out here for hours. He hesitated. Time mattered. He had minutes before the man with the tile order would leave. The money was nearly guaranteed. If he missed this job, it wouldn't come back. Rent was due. There would be no second chance with the landlord. His mother had barely any food left in the pantry. He had nothing saved. This choice wasn't theoretical. It was survival. But the woman's voice cracked as she asked again, "Is the 12 late? I don't want to miss it." Jaden closed his eyes for a moment. A single breath. The cold touched the back of his neck like a warning. He turned and pulled the wheelbarrow closer. "Ma'am," he said gently, "maybe I can help." He helped her into the tray with the same care he used when lifting his mother into bed. It took time. She apologized several times for being slow, and he told her not to worry. He folded his old jacket into a makeshift cushion beneath her and wrapped a second piece of cloth around her legs. The wheelbarrow wasn't comfortable, but it was steady. He adjusted the load, checking the balance. When he was satisfied it wouldn't tip, he looked down the road and set his hands to the handles. She smiled then, faintly. A smile shaped more by memory than the present. "You remind me of someone," she said. "My grandson. Always kind. Always rushing around with those old sneakers." Jaden looked down at his shoes, torn at the toes, the soles worn paper thin. He didn't reply. He just started walking. The city stretched before him, unfamiliar in this direction. He had never had a reason to go past the West Side industrial barrier. The woman's pendant had given him the only concrete clue, a small silver oval that hung from her neck, polished from years of wear. On the back, in elegant cursive, were 4 words: 48 Oak Hill Drive. It was a neighborhood he'd only heard about in passing, a place of stone houses, private gates, and carefully trimmed hedges. Far. Nearly 2 hours by foot, longer with a wheelbarrow and precious cargo. It sat beyond the city's reach, past the flickering streetlights and the hollowed-out factories. It was where people lived in silence and space. People who didn't know boys like Jaden existed. Still, he pushed. At first, the woman, she had said her name was Marjorie, he thought, spoke in fragments. She asked about the time, then forgot what she had asked. She mumbled names that didn't belong to him, and sometimes she closed her eyes and simply breathed. Jaden answered when he could, nodding when he couldn't. He turned down quieter roads to avoid traffic, cutting behind grocery stores and through narrow alleys where the pavement cracked like old glass. The wind picked up as they moved farther from downtown. Jaden's breath grew shallow, and his arms ached from the weight. He adjusted his grip, leaned into the pull, and kept going. Once, he nearly lost control going downhill. The wheel caught a stone and jerked hard to the right. The tray lurched, and he twisted his body to absorb the movement. Marjorie clutched the sides with both hands but didn't scream. She only looked up at him with a strange calm, as if trusting he would get her there. They paused once outside a gas station. Jaden left her parked beside the entrance and went in to buy a cup of hot tea. He used the last of his coins. The clerk didn't speak to him, just rang up the transaction and moved on. When he returned to the cart, he held the cup out to her. "You should drink first," she said, pushing it gently toward him. "You need it more." He took a sip. It burned his tongue, but the heat spread through his chest like a blessing. She drank after him, hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. They moved on. The street lights became less frequent the farther they went. The houses became taller, fences higher, and the roads smoother. Jaden felt the shift in atmosphere like a physical line. One side gray and loud, the other pale and silent. He checked the address 3 times. Oak Hill Drive appeared in white letters etched into a black iron post. Number 48 stood at the far end, guarded by a white gate with ivy clinging to its sides. The house beyond was enormous, more like a museum than a home, with tall windows and stone columns. A porch light glowed faintly at the front. Jaden stopped the wheelbarrow at the gate, breath sharp in his throat, arms shaking from the hours of labor. He stepped forward and pressed the intercom button once. Nothing. Then again. Moments passed. Then footsteps echoed on stone, and the door opened to reveal a tall, thin man in a brown robe. His face was lined, eyes wide with concern. "Miss Marjorie," he said, voice breaking with disbelief. She looked up, blinking in the light. "I went for a walk," she said, then laughed softly. "Or a ride, I suppose." The man turned to Jaden, and the look on his face shifted. First gratitude, then guilt. "Please, come in," he said. "You must be freezing." But Jaden shook his head. He stepped back, already retreating. "I have to get home," he said. "It's late." The man tried to insist, but Jaden waved him off. He scribbled his number on the back of an old receipt from his pocket and handed it over. "In case she ever needs help again," he said. Then he turned. The night air was colder now. His legs ached. He didn't know if the room he called home would still be his. He didn't know if his mother was all right. But as he walked away from the bright windows and clean stone, he felt something stir in him. Not pride, not accomplishment. Just the quiet warmth of having done the right thing. Jaden's breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale a plume of fog in the frigid night air. His shoulders burned, his arms trembled, and his hands gripped the cold metal handles of the wheelbarrow so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale beneath his dark skin. Yet he did not stop. The lights of the wealthy neighborhood slowly faded behind him as he turned onto a narrow side street, the shadows of towering trees stretching across the pavement like fingers reaching out to claim him. The quiet there was heavy and unfamiliar. No shouting from windows, no barking dogs, no sirens, just the soft squeak of the wheelbarrow's rusted wheel and the rhythmic crunch of his worn shoes against the gravel. His body felt heavier with each step, not from the absence of the old woman in the cart, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He hadn't dared to hope that the landlord might still be awake, that his key might still work. But he clung to the chance anyway, even if just for the night. Even if only to sit beside his mother for a few minutes and tell her he had done something good. By the time he reached the edge of his part of town, the night had deepened into that strange stillness that comes just before the darkest hour. The streets here were less clean, more familiar. The flickering street lights no longer startled him. They were like old neighbors, failing but present. He turned the corner onto his street, eyes scanning for the familiar shape of the cracked steps leading down into the basement entrance of the building he called home. It was the plastic bag that he saw first. It sat beside the door like an offering, his belongings haphazardly stuffed inside, the handles tied in a sloppy knot. His spare shirt, the towel with the frayed edges, the cracked phone charger, all packed and set out like yesterday's trash. His chest tightened, but he didn't let himself react. Not yet. Not until he tried the key. He climbed the steps slowly, willing his hand not to shake as he reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed lint, then nothing. He tried the other pocket, then the inside of his jacket. Panic began to rise. He turned his pockets inside out, searched the seams, bent down, and checked the wheelbarrow tray. Nothing. The key was gone. Still, he tried the knob. It didn't budge. For a moment, he stood completely still, staring at the door. Then he saw it. Taped above the knob with a strip of black electrical tape, a small, weather-worn note in blocky handwriting. Past due. Locks changed. The words struck like a slap. Final. Cold. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He didn't bang on the door, even though his heart screamed to do something, anything. Instead, he picked up the plastic bag slowly and turned away from the building. The wind scraped down the alley behind him, whistling between dumpsters and loose window panes. Jaden walked because standing still in that moment would have broken him completely. He didn't know where he was going. Not exactly. There were no friends to call, no family to turn to. Most nights he avoided the shelters. They were overcrowded, dangerous, and filled with the kind of eyes that watched too closely. But there was one place he could try. One place that had never locked him out completely, even if it never truly let him in. Johnson's Market sat on the corner of 4th and Delaney, a squat brick building with a faded green awning and a smell of oranges and old wood that seeped from its walls. It had been there since before Jaden was born, and Mr. Johnson had been behind the counter just as long. The man was tall, gray-bearded, with a permanent frown etched into his face and a voice like sandpaper. He didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. But when Jaden first started working odd jobs, it was Mr. Johnson who let him sweep the storeroom in exchange for expired bread or bruised fruit. Jaden arrived just before midnight, The back alley was littered with broken crates and the metallic scent of spilled soda. He wheeled the cart behind the dumpster and knocked gently on the side door. Once, then again, for a long time there was nothing. Then, faint shuffling. A flicker of light under the door. It creaked open an inch, then fully. Mr. Johnson stood there in a thick robe, a steaming mug in one hand. He stared at Jaden for a beat, then stepped aside without a word. Jaden murmured his thanks and stepped inside. The storeroom smelled like cardboard and citrus peel. It was cold but dry, and in the far corner sat the old cot, the same one he had slept on once, months ago, when his mother was taken to the clinic overnight. He dropped his bag beside it and sat down slowly. His legs ached, his back throbbed, and the warmth from the tea earlier had long since vanished. But here, at least, he could close his eyes without fear. Mr. Johnson didn't speak as he turned back toward the front. He just raised his mug in acknowledgement and disappeared behind the curtain. Jaden curled up on the cot, wrapping the thin blanket around his shoulders. The hum of a nearby radiator filled the silence. He didn't think about the man who had refused to wait for the tile delivery. He didn't think about the landlord, or the rent, or even the cold tile floor his mother now lay on alone. Instead, he thought of the silver pendant, the way the old woman's hand had rested lightly on the side of the cart, her voice when she said he reminded her of someone she had loved. It wasn't enough. It didn't change anything. But somehow it made the dark feel a little less heavy. He drifted into sleep, not with peace, but with something close, a quiet emptiness that held no immediate pain. Morning crept in slowly, filtered through the small grime-coated window in the storeroom. Jaden woke before the sun, his body stiff, his mouth dry. He sat up slowly, joints protesting. He folded the blanket, tucked it into the crate beside the cot, and stood. The world outside had already begun to stir. Delivery trucks coughed in the distance. A dog barked. The city, as always, moved forward. He walked to the front of the store quietly, footsteps silent on the linoleum. Mr. Johnson was already at the counter, stacking cans with a precision that spoke of long habit. He didn't look up, but when Jaden stepped behind the counter, he slid a banana and a half-warmed cup of coffee toward him without a word. Jaden took them both with a nod. He ate standing up, watching the street through the fogged window. People passed. Kids in school uniforms, adults in work boots, a woman pushing a stroller. Life. Normal, everyday life. He wondered how many of them would notice if someone like him disappeared completely. He wondered how many already had. He didn't notice the car until it stopped directly in front of the store. It was black, polished, the kind of car that didn't belong here. It glided to a stop like it belonged to a different world entirely. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a dark coat, his hair perfectly parted, his shoes spotless. He looked around once, then pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and studied it. Jaden froze. There was something deliberate about the way the man moved, the way his eyes scanned the store windows. When he opened the door and the bell above chimed, Jaden felt the shift in the room like a drop in pressure. "Excuse me," the man said, voice calm but commanding. "I'm looking for someone named Jaden." Mr. Johnson glanced over his shoulder, then back at his cans. Jaden stepped forward. "That's me." The man smiled, relieved. "Miss Marjorie asked me to find you," he said. "She remembers everything. She wanted to thank you, personally." Jaden didn't move. He looked down at the banana peel in his hand, then at the receipt still folded in his coat pocket, the one he had scrawled his number on, thinking it would never be used. A lifeline tossed into the dark. He hadn't expected anyone to catch it. The man waited, not impatient, just present. Jaden didn't know what to say. He had done what he thought was right. He hadn't asked for anything. He didn't want to be thanked, but something in him, some small ember, flared. Maybe, he thought, this wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning. Jaden stood just behind the market's front window, the remains of a banana in one hand, the taste of warm, bitter coffee lingering faintly on his tongue. The man who had stepped out of the polished black car, so unlike anything this part of town had seen in years, waited patiently a few feet away, the door to the market still held open in one hand, as if inviting Jaden to pass into another world entirely. Outside, the car idled quietly by the curb, gleaming against the backdrop of cracked sidewalks and graffiti-tagged brick walls. It looked like it had made a wrong turn and landed in someone else's life. The man introduced himself as Charles. His voice was smooth, but not rehearsed, and his coat was too fine for this part of the city. Jaden noticed the shine of his shoes, the way his shirt collar held its shape, the cut of his wool overcoat. Everything about him suggested wealth and comfort and time, things Jaden had only known as distant ideas, never as part of his own life. When Charles spoke again, his tone held something else too: sincerity. He wasn't just a messenger. "Miss Marjorie asked me to find you," he said again, softer now, as though trying not to break whatever stillness had settled over the boy. "She remembers everything. She wanted to say thank you." Jaden's stomach clenched at the name. Marjorie. He hadn't heard it again since that night, but it echoed now in his memory, the way she'd mumbled it in fragments, like a song half remembered, the way her eyes had lit up when they reached the gate. He hadn't expected anything. Least of all that she would still think of him after stepping back into her world. He looked to Mr. Johnson, who hadn't stopped arranging his shelves. Without turning, the old man muttered, "Your cot'll still be here if you need it. Go see what she wants." Jaden hesitated only a moment longer. Then, silently, he grabbed his patched-up backpack from the storeroom, slung it over one shoulder, and followed Charles out the door. The car ride was surreal. The seats were warm and soft, and the interior smelled faintly of pine and something more expensive. Leather, maybe. Jaden sat stiffly, hands clenched in his lap, not touching anything, trying not to dirty the clean spaces with his dusty clothes. Charles didn't push conversation. He simply drove, hands steady on the wheel, gaze focused ahead. As they left the market district and wound their way into neighborhoods Jaden had never seen in daylight, he watched the scenery change with a quiet kind of awe. The buildings grew taller and cleaner, their windows unbroken. The trees grew thicker, greener, and the sidewalks were wide and even. Fences lined with roses, not barbed wire. Children played in front yards with plastic castles and miniature trampolines. The world here breathed differently, less tightly wound, less hungry. When they reached the long slope leading to Oak Hill Drive, Jaden's body tensed without meaning to. He remembered pushing the wheelbarrow up this hill in the dark, every step a test of will. Now the car glided effortlessly upward. He stared out the window, silently tracing the same path he had taken before, with raw palms and frozen breath. Every curve and crack was etched into his bones. The house appeared just as he remembered it, though in daylight it seemed less like a monument and more like a memory. The light touched its stone facade with warmth, softening its edges. The gate was open this time. Charles pulled the car smoothly through and parked near the front steps. He stepped out first and opened Jaden's door, not with ceremony, but with care. "She's inside," he said. "I'll show you." Jaden followed him into the house, heart pounding. The interior was warm, quiet, and filled with the scent of lavender and old books. The ceilings stretched high above them, and every room they passed seemed to hold more light than Jaden thought possible. He walked carefully, unsure if his boots would leave marks on the polished floor. They stopped in a room filled with sunlight and heavy curtains. Bookshelves lined the walls, and the furniture was soft and worn with use rather than style. Seated near the window, wrapped in a shawl, was Marjorie. She turned as he entered, and for a moment her eyes searched his face like she was trying to place him. Then her smile bloomed, slow, warm, and real. "You," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you brought me home." Jaden stepped inside, suddenly aware of his clothes, his posture, his hands. He wanted to disappear, but her gaze anchored him. "I remember everything," she continued, "every street, every word you spoke. You didn't treat me like a stranger. You made me feel safe." He opened his mouth to respond, but found that no words came. He nodded instead, unsure what else to offer. Marjorie held out her hand, and when he took it, he noticed how firm her grip was despite its delicacy. "I don't know your story," she said, "but I'd like to, and if you don't have a place to go, I would be honored to offer you one here. Not just for tonight, for longer, if you'd let me. This house has too many rooms and not enough kindness. You would change that." Jaden blinked, heart beating hard. Her words felt too large, like clothing he hadn't grown into. He took a step back. "That's kind of you," he said, voice low, "but I didn't do it to get anything. I just wanted you to be safe. That's all." Marjorie's eyes didn't leave his. "And that," she said gently, "is exactly why I want you to stay." There was silence then, not uncomfortable, but uncertain. Jaden didn't know how to carry a moment like this. No one had ever offered him more than scraps before. He had never been invited in, not like this, not with sincerity and softness and no catch. Still, he shook his head. "Thank you," he said, "really, but I should go." Charles reappeared at the door as if sensing the moment. He didn't speak, only stood quietly, waiting. Jaden turned, gave Marjorie one last nod, and followed Charles back outside. The sun was lower now, brushing the tops of the trees in gold. The car waited, door open. Jaden got in without a word, and they drove back down the hill in silence. He returned to Johnson's Market just as dusk settled in. The streets were noisier now, cars honking, voices rising, the clatter of city life returning in full force. He let himself back in through the storeroom door. The cot was still there, the blanket folded neatly. Nothing had changed, and yet something had. He lay down that night and stared at the ceiling. The same smell of citrus, the same hum of the radiator. But his mind was full of light and stone and the sound of Marjorie's voice saying, "You made me feel safe." He didn't sleep easily, but when he finally drifted off, it was without the same weight as before. There was still uncertainty, still fear, still the gnawing ache of hunger. But there was also something else now. A question, perhaps, or a door left slightly ajar. He had been seen, not for what he lacked, but for what he carried. And though he didn't know it yet, he would return to that house. Not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. The morning arrived with a soft gray hush that spread slowly across the cracked windows of Johnson's Market. The world outside stirred as it always did. Cars coughed to life, boots clapped against wet sidewalks, and the metallic clang of delivery trucks echoed off the brick buildings like a weary heartbeat. Inside the storeroom, Jaden was already awake. He had risen with the first trace of light, folding the blanket carefully and stacking empty crates in their proper corner without being asked. His movements were quiet, precise, and steady, as though staying in motion might keep his thoughts from catching up to him. He had barely slept. The memory of the previous day clung to him like a film on his skin. Marjorie's voice, the softness in her eyes, the house that seemed too clean, too warm, too wide to be real. Her offer had not been a gesture of pity. It had felt like something else entirely. But Jaden didn't know how to accept things freely. His life had trained him to expect that kindness came with a catch. He had seen what happened to boys who believed too easily, and yet he could not shake the weight of her words. "You made me feel safe." That, more than anything, had echoed in the silence of the night. Mr. Johnson found him at the front counter, already sweeping the entranceway, his back straight, his face unreadable. The old man handed him a slice of bread with a smear of peanut butter and half an apple, still crisp despite a bruise near the stem. No words were exchanged. They understood each other in the way two people who have known cold understand the value of shared heat. Jaden ate slowly, eyes fixed on the street beyond the window. The city moved forward, indifferent and constant. Children walked to school with backpacks that bounced against their shoulders. A man in a reflective vest blew warm air into his cupped hands. Life continued in its usual rhythm, unaware that something within Jaden had begun to shift. He was rinsing the mop bucket in the back when the bell above the front door rang, not with the casual jingle of a customer, but with the measured, deliberate tone of someone stepping into the unfamiliar with purpose. Jaden paused, the water running over his hands turning colder by the second. He heard Mr. Johnson's voice, a grunt, a low response, then footsteps crossing the floor. When he emerged from the back, he saw her. Marjorie stood just inside the shop, wrapped in a wool shawl, her white hair neatly pinned back, a small leather handbag tucked in the crook of one arm. She looked older in the daylight, but no less dignified. Her eyes scanned the room until they found him, and when they did, they softened instantly. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said gently, her voice warmer than the morning light that filtered through the dusty window. "I've been thinking about you all night." Jaden stood still, unsure of what to do with his hands, unsure of how to carry himself in the presence of someone who had once looked so fragile and now radiated clarity. He gave a slight nod, unsure if he could trust his voice to remain steady. She stepped forward slowly, as if careful not to startle him. "I know this isn't exactly the sort of place someone like me is expected to visit," she said, glancing around at the shelves of canned soup and the refrigerator humming faintly in the corner. "But I had to come." Jaden glanced toward Mr. Johnson, who merely went back to organizing receipts with the same indifferent shrug he offered the universe. Marjorie turned her attention back to Jaden. "I've lived in that big house for a very long time," she began, her voice quieter now, "and it has never felt so empty as it did this morning, not even after my husband passed, not even after my grandson." She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she looked down at her handbag, unclasped it, and retrieved a folded sheet of thick stationery. She held it out to him with both hands. "This isn't a contract," she said. "It's not a deal or an arrangement, it's an invitation." Jaden took the paper slowly, eyes scanning the ink. The handwriting was slightly shaky, but the words were clear. It was an offer to stay. At the house, not just for a night, but for as long as he needed. A room of his own, a modest monthly stipend. And beneath that, in softer script, a promise: "We will find a way for you to return to school, if you still want that." His hands trembled as he held the page. He had never seen anything like this. Not just the paper or the writing, but the meaning behind it. It was more than a gift. It was trust. "I don't expect an answer right now," she said, reading the conflict on his face, "but I wanted you to know the offer stands, whether tomorrow or next month." Jaden looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no condescension in them, no pity, only hope. She reached into her bag once more and pulled out a small envelope. "Inside is my number. You don't need to decide today. Just don't disappear on me." She left the envelope on the counter, gave him a smile that didn't press for anything, and turned to go. As she reached the door, she paused and glanced back. "You remind me of someone I loved very much," she said. "But more than that, you remind me of someone I want to know." Then she stepped outside, her figure receding down the sidewalk like a leaf caught in the morning wind. Jaden didn't move for a long time. He held the paper in his hands, the invitation as surreal as it was sincere, and let the silence wrap around him like a question. He returned to work that day, but everything felt different. The cans were heavier. The light through the front window seemed sharper. When customers came in, he watched them differently, wondering what stories they carried, what doors they had opened or closed in their lives. He couldn't stop thinking about the offer. It followed him through every task, settled behind his eyes like a second heartbeat. By the afternoon, he had folded the paper neatly and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't speak of it to Mr. Johnson. He didn't tell anyone. But when the sun began to fall, painting the buildings in amber and rose, he made a decision. When Charles arrived in the black car just after 5, Jaden was ready. He had packed his few belongings in his backpack, his mother's scarf, his own tattered journal, a photograph torn at the edge of her smiling on a summer afternoon before the stroke. He didn't say goodbye in long speeches. Mr. Johnson handed him a paper bag with 2 sandwiches and a muttered, "About time," and Jaden nodded once in return. The ride back up Oak Hill felt less alien now. He watched the trees pass with a steady gaze, no longer counting every second, no longer wondering if he belonged. When they pulled into the driveway, the house was lit from within, its windows glowing softly against the encroaching dusk. Marjorie met him at the door, her face alight with something that looked like quiet relief. "I hoped you would," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. The warmth inside enveloped him instantly. It didn't feel like luxury. It felt like safety. He was shown to a room upstairs, a space filled with light, shelves lined with books, a desk beside the window, and a small bed made with crisp white sheets. There was a vase of fresh flowers on the nightstand. No one had ever placed flowers for him before. No one had prepared a space with the intention of him being part of it. He placed his bag on the floor and sat down on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees. The quiet was strange, but not uncomfortable. Marjorie knocked once and entered with a cup of tea. "I'll let you rest," she said, placing it gently beside him. "Tomorrow we'll talk about school, but tonight, just be." She left the room, and for a long time, Jaden didn't move. Then, slowly, he took the cup in his hands and brought it to his lips. The warmth spread through him like sunrise through frost. He looked out the window, past the trees, towards the city he had come from, the street where he had met her, the market where he had slept, the wheelbarrow that still sat beside a dumpster, waiting. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale fully. And then he closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he finally could. Jaden awoke to the sound of birdsong, a soft, irregular melody weaving its way through the open window of the upstairs room. The light filtering in was warm and golden, dappling the bedspread and the polished floorboards with a pattern that looked like moving water. For a long moment he lay still, uncertain of where he was, uncertain whether the memories of the past few days had been real or a dream conjured by cold and hunger. Then the scent of bread toasting, distant and faintly sweet, settled into the room like reassurance. His eyes opened fully, and the ceiling above him, white and smooth and entirely free of cracks, confirmed it. He was still here. He sat up slowly, still unused to the sensation of waking on a bed with sheets that hadn't been slept in by strangers before him. The cotton blanket had a slight weight to it, enough to feel like an embrace. Beside the bed, a small vase of flowers stood unchanged. Lilies, maybe, or something like them. On the desk near the window, a stack of blank notebooks and 2 pens had been placed neatly in a row, as if to remind him that this space belonged to him now, or at least could. Downstairs, the house moved gently, with the kind of rhythm that comes from habit and routine. There was no television blaring, no arguing through thin walls, no neighbors pounding upstairs. Only the quiet sounds of a kettle whistling, a floorboard creaking under careful footsteps, the distant thud of a newspaper landing on the front porch. It was a quiet that felt earned, not empty. Jaden rose and washed his face in the small adjoining bathroom, still startled by the brightness of the tiles and the fact that hot water came on without negotiation. He dressed quickly in the cleanest clothes he had, a shirt too large, jeans faded thin at the knees, and stepped into the hallway, unsure of whether to descend like a guest or a resident. He found Marjorie in the sunroom, seated at a table set with 2 plates, 2 mugs, and a small dish of sliced fruit. Her posture was relaxed, and she smiled when she saw him, not with the polite distance of someone being charitable, but with something closer to gladness. There was no pressure in her expression, no expectation, only welcome. "You slept well, I hope," she said, her voice light and clear. "It's a quiet house, sometimes too quiet, but I imagine that's a change for you." He nodded, unsure of how much to say. Words had never been his best currency. Action had always served him better, but he murmured a thank you, and when she gestured for him to sit, he did. They ate without rush. Marjorie asked simple questions, whether he preferred tea or coffee, whether he liked butter on his toast, what books he'd read at school before he stopped going. She didn't prod. She didn't dwell on the things he didn't answer. And when silence stretched between them, it felt more like breathing than absence. After breakfast, she led him through the house, not as a tour guide showing off, but as someone inviting another into the spaces that mattered to her. The library, with tall shelves and deep chairs that smelled of leather and old stories. The kitchen, clean and functional, where she told him she used to bake with her grandson before life pulled them in different directions. The back garden, still waking from winter, where patches of lavender and rosemary reached toward the warming sun. "There's no gardener anymore," she said softly. "I like it better this way, messier, but honest." Jaden said nothing, but he touched the rosemary with gentle fingers, inhaling its sharp, fresh scent. They returned to the sunroom in the early afternoon, and she placed a slim envelope on the table before him. Inside was paperwork, basic, she said, just enough to cover his stay legally, protect both of them, and set up a small bank account in his name. Nothing binding. nothing permanent. But something that said, "This isn't charity. This is trust." Jaden stared at the papers for a long time. He could read well enough, though slowly. The words blurred slightly in places, not because he didn't understand, but because the weight of what they offered pressed hard against everything he had ever been told. That people like him didn't get things for free, that homes weren't given, that offers always had strings, and that kindness was a trick waiting to be turned cruel. But Marjorie didn't push him. She simply poured herself another cup of tea and waited. In the days that followed, Jaden remained cautious. He slept in the room, ate at the table, walked through the garden, but kept a certain part of himself folded tight. It wasn't mistrust, it was instinct. A shell built over years, too thick to shed in a moment. Yet, slowly, cracks formed. One evening, he found himself alone in the library. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the room was lit only by a single lamp near the corner chair. He pulled down a book almost at random, a collection of short stories with dog-eared pages and a faded cover. He read the first story twice, not because he didn't understand it, but because it made something in his chest ache. The protagonist reminded him of himself, not in background, not in skin, but in the way he moved through the world, half holding his breath. The next morning, he asked Marjorie if he could read another. She smiled without surprise. "You can read as many as you like," she said. "They're yours now, too." Later that week, they spoke about school. "I made a few calls," she said, gently placing a brochure in front of him. "There's a program for returning students, flexible hours, small classes. You wouldn't be the only one trying to catch up." Jaden stared at the page, a school building, a smiling face. It felt distant, like a dream half remembered. He had left school not because he wanted to, but because survival had come first. The idea of going back felt indulgent, like a child asking for more cake after dinner. But Marjorie didn't treat it that way. "I think you're ready," she said, "and I think you deserve to finish what was started." He didn't answer immediately, but that night he stayed up reading until his eyes burned. He wanted to believe it was possible. And slowly, over the following days, he did. There were other changes. He began waking earlier, helping with breakfast, even though she insisted he didn't have to. He offered to carry groceries when Charles returned from errands. He cleared leaves from the garden paths without being asked, not to earn his keep, but because it felt right. Because he wanted the house to reflect the quiet peace he was beginning to feel inside. One afternoon, he asked about the room at the end of the hall, the one always kept closed. Marjorie paused before answering. "That was my grandson's room," she said quietly. "He passed 5 years ago. It's mostly the same as he left it." Jaden nodded, understanding without pressing. Some doors took time. By the third week, he had registered for classes. The scholarship paperwork had been completed in near silence. Marjorie had insisted it come from a fund she'd created for others like him. Not in his name, but in memory of someone she once lost. He didn't ask who. She didn't say. But he saw the weight behind her smile, and he carried it gently. At night, Jaden sometimes walked out onto the balcony just outside the hall. From there, the city lights shimmered in the distance. He could see the rooftops of the world he came from, the places where his body still remembered hunger, where his name was just another problem, another mouth to feed. And yet, he felt no urge to run back. Not anymore. He thought of his mother often. She was still in the care of the shelter's medical wing, still recovering slowly. Marjorie had offered to help arrange visits, even help with better care, but Jaden had asked for time. "I want to come to her not with empty hands," he had said. "I want to come back as someone she doesn't have to worry about." Marjorie hadn't argued. She understood. And so the days passed, not in leaps, but in steady steps. Jaden attended orientation for his classes, began outlining goals for the semester, found a rhythm to his days that didn't revolve around survival, but around progress, around hope. He still kept the old wheelbarrow. It was parked now in a corner of the garage covered with a tarp. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It reminded him of where he began, of the night he had seen someone others ignored, and how that simple act had unlocked a door neither of them knew they were looking for. He didn't feel like a guest anymore. He felt like someone building something, not just a future, but a home. The morning began with rain, not the fierce kind that came with thunder and wind, but a soft, steady curtain that blurred the windows and washed the stone path outside into shades of slate and ash. Jaden stood at the kitchen sink, a towel slung over his shoulder, rinsing a chipped porcelain mug he had grown fond of. The sky beyond the glass was a smooth gray, the garden soaked and still. Yet there was peace in the silence, a calm that reached into his chest and settled somewhere deep. He had come to know the house in all its moods: sunlit afternoons, quiet dusks, the hush of dawn when only the walls breathed. And this, the rain, felt like the house's reflection. Thoughtful, steady, remembering. Classes had started a week ago. Jaden took the bus to the city 3 days a week, a short ride compared to the distances he used to walk. The community school was smaller than he had expected. Low brick buildings, narrow hallways, teachers who learned his name within the first day. There was no shame there. The other students were like him, returned from absence, some older, some younger, all of them held together by the silent acknowledgement that life had not waited for them. But they were here now, and that was what mattered. He sat near the window in every classroom, a habit from long ago, and took notes with a quiet hunger, not to impress, not to compete, but because knowledge, once out of reach, now lay in his hands, and he didn't intend to let it go. At home, his days followed a new rhythm. Mornings began with shared breakfast and a walk through the garden. Sometimes Marjorie joined him, holding her shawl tightly around her shoulders as she spoke about her son's old greenhouse and the herbs she used to grow. Other times, she simply watched him from the porch as he trimmed hedges or carried the compost to the back fence. He found comfort in the work, the repetition, the visible proof that something neglected could still bloom with care. In the afternoons, he studied. In the evenings, they talked. Over tea, over soup, over the ticking of the grandfather clock that stood like a sentinel in the hallway. Their conversations wandered, from literature to music to how the city had changed. Marjorie listened without interruption, and in return, Jaden learned the texture of her silences, the way she looked into her cup when remembering hurt, the sharpness in her gaze when she spoke of the past not as regret, but as lesson. Then, one day, she brought out a folder. They were seated in the library, the rain still humming against the roof, the fire flickering low. "I want to show you something," she said, placing the folder on the table between them. Inside were documents, legal forms, foundation drafts, a mission statement in clean serif font, though clearly still in its early stages. "It's something I've thought about for years," she explained, "but I never had the energy to begin. Now I do, or rather now I have a reason." Jaden flipped through the pages slowly, reading the lines carefully. The name at the top of the proposal caught him off guard. The Willow Light Fund. "It's named after the street I couldn't remember that night," she said with a soft smile. "The one I thought the bus would take me to, Willow Lane. It was never a real street, just a word stuck in my head, but it feels right now." He looked up, unsure what to say. She continued before he could respond. "I want it to be something real, not a charity from a guilty old woman with too many rooms. A foundation with a purpose. To help those who fall between the cracks, the young, like you, who have no path forward, and the old, like me, who find themselves forgotten." Jaden ran his hand along the page. It didn't feel theoretical. It felt possible. "I want you to be part of it," she said, eyes meeting his, "to help design it, build it. You know better than anyone what's needed." He was quiet for a long moment, not because he doubted, but because something inside him was swelling too fast for words. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I'd like to try." And so they began. The first steps were small. Meetings in the living room with Charles and a quiet lawyer named Evelyn, who took notes quickly and said little. Conversations over dinner about goals, outreach, structure. Jaden proposed the idea of mobile assistance, vans that could bring supplies and services to those who couldn't reach shelters or were too afraid to. He spoke about the nights he had spent in the cold, the way help always seemed to come too late or not at all. Marjorie listened. She wrote it all down. They found a name for the first program, Wheels of Shelter. Inspired, of course, by Jaden's wheelbarrow, it made them both laugh. The months passed quickly, filled with tasks and plans. Jaden attended classes during the day and worked on the foundation in the evenings. He helped choose staff, met with counselors, visited shelters to speak to youth and elders. He shared his story carefully, never for sympathy, but to offer proof that people could rise. That someone could go from cold concrete floors to warm libraries without losing their soul along the way. The community responded. Slowly at first. A local center donated office space. A retired teacher volunteered to run tutoring sessions. A city grant offered seed funding. Jaden stood before a crowd at the launch event, nervous in a too large blazer, hands damp. But when he spoke, the room listened. "I'm not here because I was rescued," he said. "I'm here because someone saw me and stayed." His voice didn't tremble. The next day, the story ran in the local paper, a small piece buried under headlines. But it was real. Marjorie kept a copy in her drawer. The house changed, too. It filled again, not with people, but with purpose. Marjorie began hosting Sunday teas for women in the neighborhood who had no family nearby. Jaden helped repair the old greenhouse and started growing herbs again. He painted the garden gate a deep blue, the color of quiet evenings, and sometimes when he had a free afternoon, he would ride his bicycle into town. Not the wheelbarrow, he had stored that carefully in the shed, its wheels still crooked, its handles still wrapped in old cloth, but a proper bike Charles had restored for him. He rode past the alleys where he had once slept, the gas station where he had bought tea with his last dollar, the market where Mr. Johnson still stacked cans like a ritual. He stopped in sometimes. The old man never said much, but when he saw Jaden walk in with straighter shoulders and clearer eyes, he nodded like he'd expected it all along. One cloudy Saturday, Jaden visited the old bus stop. It hadn't changed much. The paint still peeled, the sign still hung crooked. He stood there for a long time, watching the cars pass. No one looked, no one paused. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small metal plaque engraved simply, already weatherproofed. He knelt and bolted it to the bench. It read, "Sometimes home finds you, Sometimes it rides with you. The Willow Light Fund. He stepped back, wiped his hands, and smiled. As he turned to leave, he saw a boy watching him from across the street, young, maybe 12, with a backpack too big and shoes too thin. Their eyes met. Jaden nodded once. The boy nodded back. The rain had stopped. The clouds thinned. The light filtered down through the trees, soft and patient, as if the world had been waiting to exhale. And somewhere in the city, in a room filled with books and light, Marjorie sat beside a window with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a notebook in her lap. She was writing again. Not stories of loss, but of beginnings. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next video. You won't want to miss it. And if you know